back to today's video. Today is Saturday, August 9th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the battleground state of Wisconsin and Representative Tom Tiffany from Wisconsin's 7th Congressional District, now floating and intending to run for governor in the 2026 midterm elections. Now, there has been a lot of conversation and speculation around who might run on the Democratic side in the state of Wisconsin. A large slate of candidates who have publicly expressed interest, not to mention the already declared and endorsed Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, Sarah Rodriguez. Now, the Republican primary is one that's a bit more up in the air, but with this announcement pending from Tom Tiffany, it's pretty clear that his intention is to run for governor instead of seek re-election to the United States Congress. Now, this comes at a time where many Republicans, too, were also floating with the idea that they might run, including some candidates from the 2022 cycle that floated the idea of running for governor again. People like Rebecca Kleefisch, who actually lost the primary because Donald Trump endorsed her opponent, Tim Michels, who lost the governor race back in 2024. Looking at the 2026 a governor's race that's set to take place in Wisconsin, it's going to be a very interesting one thus far. And so what we've seen in terms of this state, in terms of Wisconsin, and just generally speaking, in the Wisconsin governor's race, is that Democrats have actually had some remarkable luck in this state. In 2022, after Biden won this state by just around a point in the 2020 election, Wisconsin had a governor's race up with Governor Tony Evers, who ultimately decided not to run for re-election this cycle. But in that election, we saw that in Wisconsin, despite Republicans winning on the national level, when it came down to some of the House results in Wisconsin, we saw that in 2022, Republicans were winning the popular vote across the state by about 15 points. And then looking at the Senate election, Ron Johnson defeated then Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes by about a point across the state. On that same ballot, we saw that Tony Evers won the race against Tim Michels. And it wasn't that this race was just narrowly won. The margin here was quite significant, especially based on what the data had suggested. Larry Sabato's crystal ball had rated the race as lean for the Republican Party, and almost every other firm had said that the Democrats were going to be in a toss-up position. Not exactly the best place to be in a Democratic election when 2022 was an election that Republicans were expecting to do well in. But then we saw that the data was in fact a bit more off. Tim Michels was supposed to win 538, had him up by about 1.5 points. Real Clear Politics had him up by about 0.2%. And almost all of the polls that we had seen in the final 3 weeks of the campaign season had said that Tim Michels was going to win. To which he did not. Tony Evers won re-election, and now in 2026, there's heavy speculation that the race ends up being slightly in favor of the Democratic Party, though everybody declares it to be a toss-up right now, and I arguably do believe right now that stands to be the fairest characterization. But before Tom Tiffany had entered into this race, this GOP primary was actually shaping up to be what might be better for the Republicans in the state with Scott Walker as the former governor who had been elected in 2010, re-elected in 2014, lost his re-election in 2018, but floated with the idea that he might run for governor again in the 2026 election year. Quickly said after floating and flirting with the idea that he would not run for governor, but now leading it to the point where Tom Tiffany stands to be the front runner in this race. So now let's talk about the viability for the Republican Party with somebody like Tom Tiffany in this race. Well, you first have to understand the electoral history of Tom Tiffany. He came into office in the 2020 presidential election. In 2016 and 2018, this district was represented by Sean Duffy. Now, Sean Duffy actually left Congress, but he actually has been floated for a candidate to run this cycle because he's now the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, replacing Pete Buttigieg in this administration. Now, with Trump coming into office, he's the Secretary of Transportation. Left Congress, though, during Biden's term, the one term that he had, and was floated as this idea that he might run for governor again. But his replacement is, in fact, now the one running. And what is interesting is that depending on the election year, Tom Tiffany stands to be in a better position or worse position compared to the national average. But the good news for Republicans is that Tom Tiffany comes into the last cycle with about a Republican +2 wins above replacement score, essentially meaning that the Republicans did better with Tom Tiffany as the candidate for Congress in this district than they normally would have. at the baseline. So he outperformed expectations, capitalized on that incumbency advantage, and did better than Republicans were tracking to do in the district. And so what that looked like electorally, although this district was and continues to be a solid Republican seat, he won by about 27 points. In 2022, he won by about 24. So the national environment being, just about a point actually to the left of where it was in 2022, we saw that on the overall spread, Tom Tiffany ended up doing better. So this actually means that in 2026, he could, heavy on the could stand to be a strong candidate for the GOP in this cycle. But the big problem that I think the Republicans face in this end is that if they do clear the field for Tom Tiffany, there's no guarantee that he would be as solid of a candidate as people otherwise might think. Tom Tiffany comes into this, yes, with a congressional election and a congressional record that might seem impressive. He's winning in districts that were drawn to be Republican vote dumps for the GOP on the national level in this congressional delegation. But that overperformance, I think, in some ways should show Democrats that Tom Tiffany is, to a degree, a formidable candidate to think about. When Tony Evers decided that he was not going to run for re-election, it pretty much left open a very big field here for the state of Wisconsin for many of these candidates who otherwise, might not have entered into the race, especially on the Democratic side against an incumbent governor. But now that we're starting to see it built open, the GOP is finally finding their footing in this race after a pretty open and strong period where Democrats were pretty much the only ones considering running for governor in this state. Now, Wisconsin is going to be a battleground state. No real way to cut it. It will be probably one of the closest races that we will see on the governor level in the 2026 cycle, but that's arguably the beauty of it, too. Looking at the last presidential election, despite Donald Trump winning back the state of Wisconsin, he did so by less than a point. And based on the shifts we saw from 2020, Wisconsin was actually one of the states, you can see it here, very, very minimal shifts, one of the states that shifted by the least amount in the 2024 election in comparison to the 2020 presidential election. Even though Wisconsin went from being a blue state to a red state, again, the minimal shift there is what gave Democrats some hope and continues to give them some hope about the 2026 midterms in this state. Because when you take a look at the races up in Wisconsin, they don't have a Senate race up. So a lot of the oxygen and a lot of the focus will in fact be about this governor's race. Do they elect Sarah Rodriguez? Do they get in, the lieutenant governor to become governor? Or do they choose a U.S. representative for this seat? Now, I think this is also an interesting case of a U.S. representative who was openly toying with the idea of retirement, something that the Trump administration has been very careful to pretty much tell their incumbents, you may not run for other office, you must run for re-election in the House. But more often than not, the times that Donald Trump makes those calls or makes those heavy suggestions to members that might be considering taking time away from Congress often comes in the districts that are more competitive. I could imagine that, for instance, if someone like Derek Van Orden was in this race, a rematch that he's in against Rebecca Cook makes that decision that he doesn't want to run, that Donald Trump would call him up and say, you only won by 3 points last time. Without you on the ballot, chances are we're not going to win this race. And right now, you see it as a toss-up. He probably would shut that down immediately, or if he had wanted to run for governor or another position, he would have immediately said no. But because we are seeing that Tiffany reigns in from the Wisconsin 7th District, a district that Donald Trump won overwhelmingly in the last cycle, there's no real point of concern here, especially given that it's a 27.2% victory. Even in the bluest year for the Democratic Party that could be realistic in the next midterm, Wisconsin's 7th District will still vote for the GOP. So this district you remove from consideration as one where Donald Trump would even want to intervene. And so now we pretty much have our race set on the Republican side. There still might be some other candidates who decide to enter into the race, but ones that could be a sitting U.S. representative, not entirely sure. I think that the 2026 race is one that will be largely defined by who Donald Trump endorses on the Republican side, and chances are, especially given Tom Tiffany's voting record, and chances are without a formidable Republican opponent, or even with a quote-unquote formidable Republican opponent, Donald Trump's endorsement will reign all. Because in 2022, like I said, the GOP primary was won by Tim Michels, not because he had the electoral prowess behind him. Rebecca Kleefisch had served as the lieutenant governor of the state for 8 years straight and received endorsements from a lot of big names, people like Ted Cruz, including Tom Tiffany, who's now running this time around, numerous state representatives, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. All it took for Tim Michels was the Donald Trump endorsement. And guess what happened? That primary went to a point. Tim Michels ended up beating out Rebecca Kleefisch. I think the same exact thing will happen this time around, except Tom Tiffany will likely get the blessing from Donald Trump and will likely have a cleared field for him in this election. So one of the nation's most competitive and focused on governor races that we actually haven't talked about to the degree that we should have is now very clear who the Republican Party is going to nominate. The Democratic side, not as much, but certainly going to be an interesting race. You have the former lieutenant governor floating an idea. You have the Milwaukee County executive, the mayor of Milwaukee, other people too who are opening up the idea that they might run. I mean, this is going to be a fascinatingly close race, but at the end of the day, on the Republican side, we are that much closer to an answer as to who they might nominate, what they're going to run, how they're going to run this campaign, and if I'm being quite honest with you, looking at the history of Tom Tiffany, taking a look at his electoral history too, while he is someone who has overperformed in his district, I am not that confident that he will be in this position where he is going to be massively engaged on the Republican side, and I'm not super convinced that looking at the 2026 cycle, it will be this one that ushers in a Republican victory. In 2018, Tony Evers ran against an incumbent, arguably popular Republican incumbent in the state, who had survived a recall election, who had won in 2014 by about 6 points across the state after Obama won this state by 6-7 points in the last cycle. 2 years later, Walker's winning by 6. But in 2018, the year was above what Walker could overcome, and Tony Evers won by about 1.1%. And 4 years later, despite the national environment being significantly better for the Republican Party than 2018, about 11-point swing nationally, Wisconsin actually got bluer. So do I think 2026 will be the year that Republicans win Wisconsin? My honest answer, no. Do I think that they could come close? Sure, it's a swing state. But as of now, even with this indication, with Tiffany running on the GOP side, it will likely still be a losing race for the Republican Party, even if it is one of the more competitive ones, because that's the nature of midterm elections with unpopular Republican incumbents, which is exactly what we are facing in this upcoming next November election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.